Let's try that again. Always helps to unmute the mic. So anyway, good morning. Welcome. This is the weekly Zoom meeting for Political Science 1, class number 30013. My name is Paul Savoy, and it is Wednesday, the 20th day of May in 2020. And today, as always, several things that we want to accomplish over the next 45 minutes. First thing, in just a couple of minutes, I'm going to go ahead and give you some announcements, reminders, basically restating a lot of the information that I gave to you in the Canvas announcement that I sent to everyone in the class yesterday. Because guess what? We haven't got that many weeks left in the semester, so I want to make sure that you're aware of the remaining assignments that are coming due and some other important information as we get to the end of the semester. So we'll do that first. After we do that, I will then take any questions or comments that you have about the subject, the topic that you've been learning about this week. That is the judicial branch. That is the federal court system, which the framers created kind of, sort of, in Article 3 of the Constitution. So I will briefly restate the two major highlights about the court system that I talked about last week as I was kind of going over the Canvas class notes on the federal judiciary. And then I'll deal with any questions that you have about the federal courts, whether it stems from the Canvas notes, the assigned readings on the judicial branch that I gave you, the crash course videos that I gave you to look at, or about the discussion forum post itself, dealing with the judicial branch, specifically dealing with the topic of judicial review. And then finally, we'll spend our remaining time together this morning going over a couple of highlights in the notes for the topic that you will be learning about this week between today and next Wednesday, which is to talk a little bit about civil liberties and civil rights, the two main types of basic freedoms that we have as folks living in the United States. And as I talked about last time when I discussed the concept of judicial review, the concept of judicial review, the ability of the courts to interpret the Constitution and to strike down any government action that they believe conflicts with the Constitution, has a very significant influence on what our freedoms consist of, because as we will talk more about a bit later on today, all of our basic freedoms, all of our civil liberties and civil rights are listed in different parts of the US Constitution and therefore are subject to the judicial review process that the federal courts, specifically the US Supreme Court, invented for itself back in 1803. So that is pretty much what we are going to be playing around with for today. Before I get to anything else, though, let me remind you that, as always, this Zoom meeting is being recorded, and you can go back and review this meeting all or in part by going to our class Canvas homepage, clicking on the Confer Zoom link towards the bottom of the left-hand main menu on our class homepage. Once you get to the Confer Zoom page, then click on the link that's labeled recordings, and then you can then find the link for the day that the day's class that you want to review. Click on there and you should be in good shape. All right. So let me go ahead and just give you a few brief announcements and reminders. And so yesterday, I sent all of you a Canvas announcement, basically reminding you, especially if you haven't had a chance to take a look at the schedule for this class lately, that we are getting down to it, that we are in the last couple of weeks, the last 2.5 weeks or so of the semester. And that may come as a surprise to some of us because, as I mentioned in the text of the Canvas announcement, it feels like with the whole movement of this class from face-to-face to online, plus the whole ongoing COVID-19 crisis that we are dealing with, in some ways, it feels like this semester, the spring semester 2020, has been going on for about 2 years at this point. But it really hasn't, and we are actually down to our last couple of weeks. So in that Canvas announcement, I did go ahead and remind you about some important stuff. Specifically, I reminded you about the remaining assignments that we have due as we wrap up this class for the semester. So basically, 3 assignments that you have to worry about at this point. The first one, of course, is our very last discussion forum post assignment, which is due technically tonight at 11:59 p.m. But remember, you also have the 3-day grace period tacked on to that. So if you are not able to submit tonight's discussion forum post assignment on the judicial branch by 11:59 p.m., you will have an additional 72 hours, additional 3 days to submit it on Canvas. And if you submit it within the grace period, of course, I will not deduct any points from your score for lateness. So that is the first assignment that you do need to keep in mind. And hopefully you're starting to work on that, or will start to work on that after this Zoom meeting is over. Now, one thing I should mention, though, with regard to the discussion forum post assignments, remember at the very beginning of the semester, we were going over the initial syllabus for the class and that sort of thing. I did obviously have to make some adjustments to the assignments, to the syllabus, once we moved the class fully online. But please remember that your discussion forum post plus the 1 group quiz that we were able to do back when the class was still face-to-face, that group quiz and all of the discussion forum posts that you've been doing since we've moved online are all lumped together in one category. They all have the same 30-point value. And remember the way that I did this, so that at the end of the semester, Canvas is programmed to automatically drop your lowest score within that category of discussion forum post plus the 1 group quiz. So that if you missed one of the discussion forum posts, or if you did not take the 1 group quiz that we did towards the beginning of the semester, you don't have to worry about it because 1 assignment, your lowest scoring assignment, will be dropped from that category. So if you're missing 1 discussion forum post or the group quiz, you are fine. That score will drop at the end of the semester automatically. It will not affect your final course grade. So I just wanted to make sure that you remembered that nice little bit of the syllabus for this class. Now, next assignment that is due for you in this class is a rather big one. It is the assignment with the highest point value for the semester, 110 points, and that is the Student's Choice Project. And the Student's Choice Project will be due a week from tonight. So next Wednesday, that is the 27th of May, again at 11:59 p.m. But remember, just like every other assignment in this class, the 3-day grace period policy does also apply for the Student's Choice Project. So if you are not able to submit your Student's Choice Project to Canvas by next Wednesday at 11:59 p.m., you will have an additional 3 days, an additional 72 hours to submit it to me via Canvas. And if you do that, if you submit the project within the grace period, you will not have any points deducted for lateness. Now, if you haven't yet started working on your Student's Choice Project, now would be a good time to get going with 1 week left technically before it's due. Or if you have started it and you kind of put it aside for a while to work on other things for this class or other classes that you're taking at LBCC this semester, now would be a good time to get back to it. You really don't want to wait to the last minute to get this project completed and submitted, because remember, it is worth 110 points, and that is a substantial segment of your final course grade. So if you haven't done so already, please make sure sooner rather than later that you click on the Assignments tab on the left-hand side of our Canvas class homepage. Scroll down to where it says Student's Choice Project Revised. Click on that link, and you'll see all the information for all of the topic options for the project. Now, remember, once we made the move from face-to-face for this class to fully online, I did make some changes to the Student's Choice Project. Unfortunately, I did have to drop the community service learning option because Long Beach Unified, all the schools and all the after-school programs had closed. So BLAST was not able to provide mentoring services this semester. But because of that, well, just in general, because of the COVID-19 crisis and the movement of the class online, I did go ahead and drop the minimum page requirement for the paper. So the minimum amount of pages that you need to turn in for this project, whichever topic option that you do, is lower than it was at the beginning of the semester. And if you started out the semester planning on doing the service learning option and you at least completed the 3-hour BLAST training, your page minimum for this project is even lower still. So please make sure that you read the instructions carefully for the Student's Choice Project. Now, the other change that I made in the Student's Choice Project when we moved fully online for this class is I added a couple of additional topics that you could choose to fulfill your project, a couple of topics that I thought made sense given that we were now sheltering at home and we had some free time on our hands and we didn't know how to fill it. And so I added 2 additional topic options that involve your watching a politically themed movie and then writing about that following the prompts that I give you. So please, if you haven't yet started your Student's Choice Project, please check out all the topic options that I give you. I think there are 7 of them listed there in the assignment guidelines for the Student's Choice Project, and pick your favorite. Pick the one that you think you can do the best job of answering, okay? And once again, if you have questions about the Student's Choice Project between now and next week when it is due, please don't hesitate. Please do feel free to send me an email, send me a Canvas message, or drop into my twice weekly virtual student hours on Zoom. Remember, those take place every Monday and Wednesday afternoon, so I'll be doing one later today, every Monday and Wednesday afternoon between 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And if you want to drop in on my virtual student hours, all you have to do is go to our class Canvas homepage, scroll down past the pictures to the section labeled Basic Course Information, and there you will find both the Zoom link as well as the password that you will need to join my virtual student hours. Now, if you need to speak to me one-on-one via Zoom and your schedule doesn't work with those twice weekly virtual student hours, just send me a Canvas message or an email, let me know, and we can figure out a day and time where we can meet one-on-one on Zoom. And once we figure out that day and time, I'll go ahead and send you a custom Zoom link and password so that we can get together and talk about whatever we need to talk about. So any questions about the project, any questions about the test that I'm going to talk about next, any questions about anything having to do with the class, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. Get all of your questions answered. All right. So any questions at this point about the Student's Choice Project before I go ahead and move on and talk a little bit about test number 3? So any questions about the project, feel free to open your mic and ask the question, or if you'd rather, put your question or the comment in the group chat. And I do have a question from Cheyenne in the group chat. Is it possible to turn in the project before May 27th? Oh, absolutely. Early assignments, make my heart beat even faster. I really appreciate assignments turned in early. It's the late ones that I get a little bit more iffy about, right? So absolutely, please feel free to turn in your Student's Choice Project, submit it to Canvas whenever you get it completed. Absolutely, that's wonderful. Early is always much better than late. All right. So any other questions about the Student's Choice Project, the process, when it's due, the grace period, the topics, anything like that at this time? Okay, hearing and seeing nothing else, let me just talk briefly about the very last of the 3 assignments that we still have outstanding in this class, and that is test number 3. So the link for test number 3 on the assignments page on Canvas is open and available to you. You can start taking a look at it now. And remember, test number 3, the last of the 3 tests that we will be taking for this class for this semester, is due on the very last day of the semester. 2 weeks from today, that is Wednesday, June 3rd. And when you take a look at the assignment guidelines for test number 3 on Canvas, you will notice that the format for test number 3 is exactly the same as the format that for test number 2, the first of the 3 tests that we ended up taking fully online and submitting via Canvas. So it is worth 100 points. It has the same 2-part format. Short answers in part 1 worth 60 points maximum. Mini essay in part 2 worth the remaining 40 points maximum. Now, the nice thing about test number 3, just like our previous tests, is test number 3 is not cumulative. So it is not, I'm not going to ask you questions on test number 3 that go all the way back to the beginning of the semester when we were still face-to-face. So test number 3 is only covering the information that we have learned about in this class since test number 2, right? So it's going to be covering our discussions of Congress, the presidency, the courts, as well as civil liberties and civil rights. And that's it. So remember, just like last time, test number 3 is completely open book and open note. Okay. So as you're working on test number 3, please feel free to consult all of the Canvas class notes that I've given you on all of the top subjects covered in test number 3. Please feel free to go back and look at any of the assigned readings for any of those topics to give you helpful information. If you feel the need to, please feel free to go and review any of the crash course videos that I've had you look at since test number 2. It's completely open book and open note. All right. And again, it works the same way as always. With part 1, I give you a list, I think, of 23 terms to choose from in part 1. Choose any 8 of those 23 terms. Pick the 8 terms that you feel you can do the best job answering. And in about 3 sentences each, give me a basic definition of that term and also tell me why that term is significant, why it's important. What does other concepts, what other ideas does it connect to that we've been talking about, that we have been learning about in this class? So 8 terms, about 3 sentences each, and each of those 8 terms will be worth a maximum of 7.5 points. And that's how we get to the 60 points possible in part 1 of the test. Part 2, of course, as always, the mini essay section. This time I give you 4 potential mini essay questions to choose from. So carefully read through those 4 questions and choose the 1 question out of the 4, again, that you feel you can do the best job of answering. And then respond to that question in approximately 5 paragraphs. Maybe it'll be a little bit less. Maybe it'll be a little bit more than 5 paragraphs, but do make sure that you respond to all of the elements that I give you in the question. So that approximately 5 paragraph mini essay is worth the remaining 40 points possible in test number 1. So one other thing, though, to mention about, or test number 3, I should say, not test number 1, pardon me. One other thing to mention about test number 3, and this also goes back to a policy that I've had in this class from day 1. Remember what I told you on the first day of class as we were going through the syllabus, that at the end of the semester, your lowest test score automatically drops. And that still is the case. Now, remember, originally, when we were still face-to-face, we were supposed to take 4 tests this semester. Once we had to move the class fully online, I realized that didn't make a whole lot of sense, so I dropped it down to 3 tests. But even though we are taking 3 tests now, still, at the end of the semester, your lowest test score of the 3 drops and is not counted towards your final course grade. I only count your 2 highest test scores from the semester. Now, what that means, first of all, is that if you haven't completed either test number 1 or test number 2, that's not a problem. Just take test number 3 and you should be in good shape, right? But it also means that if you have taken the first 2 tests and you are satisfied with the scores that you received on your first 2 tests, so in other words, if you don't think that you can score any better on test number 3 than you did on either test number 1 or test number 2, then you can choose to simply not take test number 3. Don't take it. Don't submit anything to me on Canvas. And that is the score that I will drop at the end of the semester. And I'll count the 2 scores that you already have in the grade book for test number 1 and test number 2. Now, looking at the grade book for this class, I noticed that a number of you really did well. You really aced test number 1 and test number 2. So think about it, if you did really well on those first 2 tests and you are satisfied with those first 2 test scores, you have no need to take test number 3. And that is a great reward for the hard work and the success that you've had with test number 1 and test number 2. So yeah, feel free to not take test number 3 if you like your first 2 scores, and it will drop as your low test score, okay? Now, obviously, if you've taken test number 1 and test number 2, but you are not satisfied with one or both of those scores, if one or both of those scores are lower than you would like it to be, then definitely take test number 3, see if you can bring your course grade up a little bit, all right? And if you have any questions about having to do with the test between now and the due date in 2 weeks, again, send me an email, send me a Canvas message, stop by during my virtual student hours on Zoom. Do whatever you need to do to get your questions answered. But for right now, any questions about test number 3 or any questions about anything else having to do with the class? And again, you can either unmute your mic and ask or put a question in the group chat. Anybody? All right, so let us move on. And the next thing that I want to do is to talk a little bit about the discussion forum post assignment, or at least the topic that your discussion forum post assignment is related to, the last one that is due tonight at 11:59 p.m. And that deals with the federal court system, the judicial branch of the United States, which the framers created rather briefly and vaguely, as we talked about last week, in Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution. Now, specifically, the discussion forum post question that you are going to be working on that is due tonight, plus the grace period, deals with one of the parts of our class notes from last week that I highlighted for you during last week's Zoom meeting. And that is the topic of judicial review. So first of all, are there any specific questions that any of you have dealing either with the class notes on the judicial branch from last week, the assigned reading on the judicial branch from this past week, any of the crash course videos dealing with the court system from this past week, or about the discussion forum post on the judiciary itself? So any specific questions that you have on anything having to do with your learning on the federal court system? Anybody? Okay, so what I want to do then for just a couple of minutes is, since the discussion forum post that's due tonight deals specifically with judicial review, I will go ahead and just briefly talk about judicial review one more time. I'll briefly review what we said about judicial review during our Zoom class meeting last week, just to make sure it's clear, because judicial review, it will be an important piece in talking about civil liberties and civil rights which we'll be learning about this week. And by the way, civil liberties and civil rights is the very last bit of new material that we will be learning about in this class for this semester. So we are nearly done. Think about that. It's a good thing, right? So judicial review. Remember what we said last week? We said last week, in kind of highlighting some of the important stuff in the judiciary notes from Canvas, that the framers, for a variety of reasons that we talked about last week, really didn't sweat the details when they were creating the federal court system in Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution. That Article 3 was extremely short and extremely vague. Well, who cares? Why was that significant? Well, remember what we said, that the U.S. Supreme Court, very early on in its history in 1803, not that long after our current Constitution became law, the U.S. Supreme Court took advantage of the lack of detail in Article 3. And they took advantage by essentially inventing a massive new power for themselves that the framers of the Constitution may or may not have intended for federal courts to have. And that massive invented power that the Supreme Court created in the very famous 1803 Supreme Court decision in the case of Marbury versus Madison was this thing that we call judicial review. And remember, as we talked about last week, judicial review has two main components. And one thing is for sure, remember what we said last week, the framers believed when they created the courts in Article 3 back in 1787, the framers firmly believed that the federal courts would be by far the least powerful and the least dangerous of the three national government branches. But guess what? Once the courts invented judicial review in 1803, they became a whole lot stronger and a whole lot more influential. Why? Well, because let's review the two main pieces of judicial review. The first main part of judicial review, which is pretty impressive in itself, pretty powerful in itself, is that under this judicial review idea, it is the courts that have the final responsibility to interpret the Constitution, to interpret the actual words of the Constitution, and to tell everybody else in the United States, the president, Congress, the states, the American people, to tell all of us what the actual words of the Constitution mean in reality, mean in practice. And remember, as we've been saying really throughout the semester, a lot of the language in the Constitution is either really fancy, kind of complicated, kind of hard to decipher and understand, or it's really, really vague and unclear. And so what that means is that anybody who has the final authority to interpret the Constitution and tell us what the Constitution means, those folks have a whole lot of power, right? Why? Because remember what we've been saying since day one of this semester. Everything that happens in the U.S. political system, everything that the U.S. government does is described and prescribed somewhere in the U.S. Constitution. Therefore, when the courts create judicial review, when the Supreme Court creates judicial review in 1803, the court basically says, hey, guess what? We have the last word in terms of everything that government does. We have the last word in everything that happens in the U.S. political system, because everything that happens in the U.S. political system is described in the Constitution, and we're the ones who say what the Constitution means, right? So just with that first major piece of judicial review by itself, you see how empowered the federal court system becomes, and the Supreme Court in particular, right? But that's only half the story. Because remember what we also talked about last week. that the second piece, the second major part of this judicial review power is equally massive, equally important as the first. And here it is. So once the courts interpret the language, interpret the words in some part of the Constitution, they are then able to apply their interpretation and strike down, that is, kill, destroy, get rid of any government action that they believe, that the court believes conflicts with their interpretation of the Constitution. So if the Supreme Court in the end believes that some action the president took conflicts with what is said in the Constitution, they can strike down, they can eliminate that presidential action. Same thing for Congress. If Congress passes a law or takes another action that the court believes conflicts with their interpretation of the Constitution, that congressional law or action is dead. It's gone. It's eliminated, right? Same thing for any action taken by any of the 50 state governments. The Supreme Court can strike down and invalidate any state government action that they believe conflicts with the Constitution as well. So this is a truly massive power. Not only can the courts tell us what the Constitution means, but they can strike down any government action that conflicts with their interpretation of the Constitution. And what makes that so relevant to what we are about to talk about now, civil liberties and civil rights, is because, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, all of our basic freedoms that we have as folks living in the United States. And notice, I didn't say all the basic freedoms that we have as US citizens. I said all the basic freedoms that we have as folks living in the United States, because most civil liberties and civil rights apply to citizens and non-citizens living in the United States. So here's the thing. How do we know what our freedoms are? How do we know what our civil liberties and civil rights consist of? They're all listed. They're all written down in different parts of the Constitution. Aha! What that means is that because all of our freedoms are listed in different parts of the Constitution, that means that because of this judicial review power that we just reviewed, in the end, the US Supreme Court has the last word in telling us what our freedoms consist of, how far they extend, how deep are they, and under what circumstances is government allowed to limit them. So that's the really important connection between our basic freedoms, our civil liberties and civil rights, and this power of judicial review. The federal courts, and in the end, the Supreme Court, has complete authority to tell us what our freedoms are and what our freedoms aren't. And guess what? As you get into the class notes that I posted for you on Canvas, there's 2 sets on civil liberties and civil rights. Once you get into the class notes and the assigned reading and the crash course videos, what you'll realize is that over time, over history, the US Supreme Court often changes its minds about our freedoms. Over time, the courts will reinterpret certain parts of the Constitution and therefore reinterpret what some of our freedoms actually consist of. And sometimes when the courts reinterpret our freedoms, we end up getting more freedom, more expansive freedom. But other times, when the Supreme Court reinterprets our freedoms, we end up getting less freedom than we used to have. So it can be a really mixed bag. But that's the connection between judicial review, which you're working on for your discussion forum post this week, and civil liberties and civil rights, which we're going to be learning about between now and next Wednesday. And then I'm going to hit some highlights for you on now in just a couple of minutes. Okay. So any questions about this concept of judicial review? Questions or comments or problems or anything like that? Anybody? Okay, so what we want to do then in the last 10 minutes or so that we have left is I want to hit what I think is the biggest highlight in the notes that I've given you dealing with civil liberties and civil rights. Now, note, there is no discussion forum post assignment for civil liberties and civil rights next week. I'm giving you next week off for discussion forum posts, essentially, so that you can concentrate on finishing up your student's choice project. But if you look at test number 3, there are some questions both in part 1 and part 2 dealing with civil liberties and civil rights. So if you go to our modules page on Canvas for our class, you will notice yesterday I opened up the civil liberties and civil rights module for you. And on there, I posted 3 crash course videos that you can look at dealing with civil liberties and civil rights. And I also posted 2 sets of notes. The first set of notes, which is basically the comparison between a general comparison between civil liberties and civil rights. Those are the notes that is one big 2-column table, right? And then the second set of notes is a bigger historical overview of how civil rights have evolved in the United States. Now, what I want to focus on in the remaining time that we have left today deals with the first set of notes, the one that's one big, 2-column table, the general comparison of civil liberties and civil rights. So if you have those notes available to you, you might want to pull them up and take a look at them as we go through and talk about this. Because here's the thing. Oh, let me grab. Oh my goodness, where did my prop go? Oh, there it is. Thank goodness. I do have a prop, which I'll show you in a minute. But here's the thing. The most important piece of the notes on civil liberties and civil rights that I want to highlight for you today is because of a very common mistake that we see being made all the time by folks who really should know better, okay? So specifically, if you are watching the news on TV or listening to the news on the radio, if anybody still does that anymore, or if you are watching or reading the news online, and you hear either journalists, reporters, or you even hear our elected political leaders, our president, our members of Congress, other elected officials. If you're in the news media and you hear our elected officials or others talking about our basic freedoms as folks living in the United States, they make a very big fundamental mistake in how they discuss our basic freedoms. A mistake that they should have learned to avoid when they took Poli-Sci 1, but who knows, right? Now, what is this mistake? Well, here's the thing. As you have probably already figured out by now, as I've already mentioned when I was talking about judicial review a few minutes ago, the basic freedoms that we have as folks living in the United States come in 2 basic varieties. We have 2 major types of freedoms as folks living in the United States. We have civil liberties on the one hand and civil rights on the other. And as you will be learning about as you go through the class notes and the assigned readings and the crash course videos on this subject, you will know, as I mentioned earlier, that all of our basic freedoms, all of our civil rights, and all of our civil liberties are listed in different parts of the US Constitution, right? But here's the problem, okay? When the president, members of Congress, journalists, others talk about our basic freedoms, they tend to make this mistake. In talking about our basic freedoms, in describing our basic freedoms, they tend to use the terms civil liberties and civil rights interchangeably. So they talk about civil liberties and civil rights as if they mean the exact same thing. And guess what? They don't. Okay. Now, civil liberties and civil rights are very closely connected concepts. They are very similar concepts. They are highly interrelated with each other. But they are also at the same time distinct concepts. Civil liberties are not the same things as civil rights. So I want to show you right at the outset, to avoid the mistake that the president makes, that members of Congress makes, that journalists makes, that other so-called experts that you see on the news talking about our basic freedoms, that they make all of the time, because they should know better. And guess what? You'll know better than they do now on this subject. So here's the thing. The best way to understand the relationship between civil liberties and civil rights is to think of them as being two sides of the same coin. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, here is where I whip out my prop, right? Now, what I am holding in my hand, and you can't see it very well, I'll go close up to the camera with it in just a minute. But what I am holding in my hand is an ordinary US quarter, a 25-cent piece. Now, if you take a look at a quarter or any type of coin that we use in the United States, or really any type of coin that are used in most other countries around the world, if you carefully examine a coin, what you will notice is that 99% of the time, the images, the pictures, and the words that are stamped on one side of the coin are different than the images, pictures, and words stamped on the other side of the coin. So that's what I mean when I say two sides of the same coin. There's different stuff stamped on each side of the coin. So for example, if you take a look at this quarter, and let me go close up into the camera. If you look, there's the front side of the quarter, right? And there you see a lovely side view of one of the framers of the US Constitution, right? Lovely. But then if you flip the coin over and you look at the back side of the coin, you see something very different. No framers are depicted on the back side of this coin. Instead, on this particular quarter, you see the state seal, the official state seal of the state of Wisconsin, okay? So the basic message is, on this quarter and on most coins, all coins in the US and most coins around the world, there is different stuff printed on each side of the coin, okay? Now, this is the best way to understand the relationship between civil liberties and civil rights. They are two sides of the same coin. Now, what I mean by that is that on the one hand, civil liberties and civil rights are very tightly connected with each other. They are basically inseparable from one another. You can't really pry civil liberties and civil rights apart from each other. Just like it would be impossible for me to separate the two sides of this coin, even if I had a very precise laser cutter, right? I wouldn't be able to separate the two sides of the coin. I'd probably just melt the whole coin and burn my fingers in the process, right? Not a very good idea. So that's what I'm saying. On the one hand, civil liberties and civil rights are completely connected, very tightly interconnected, interwoven with each other. You can't separate them, okay? So they're very similar concepts. However, even though civil liberties and civil rights are tightly connected with each other, like the two sides of the coin, they are also different from each other. They are distinct from each other. Just like each side of the coin has something different stamped on it. Now, Basically, and here's the difference between the two, and you can get more details on this at the very top of the first set of notes that I've given you that say general comparison of civil liberties and civil rights. But here's the basic difference. Civil liberties and civil rights both deal with our basic freedoms, but they deal with our basic freedoms from completely opposite perspectives. So in other words, our civil liberties represent things that government cannot do to us. Listen to that again. Our civil liberties represent things that government cannot do to us. In other words, civil liberties are basic freedoms that all of us who live in the United States have, and government is not supposed to be able to take those freedoms away from us under most circumstances. So again, civil liberties are things that government cannot do to us, right? Now, civil rights, on the other hand, also deal with our basic freedoms, but they deal with our basic freedoms in the exact opposite way that civil liberties does, right? Because remember what we said, civil liberties are things that government cannot do to us, right? But civil rights, on the other hand, on the other side of the coin, represent things that government must do for us. Notice the difference there. Civil liberties, things that government cannot do to us. Civil rights, things that government must do for us. The exact opposite, right? In other words, with civil rights, the Constitution tells the U.S. national government, okay, here's the deal, national government. There are certain basic freedoms that all folks living in the United States have, and it is your job, national government, to protect those freedoms, to make sure that nobody in society takes people's civil rights away from them. So notice the difference. On the one hand, civil liberties says, government, there are certain freedoms that you can't mess with, certain freedoms that you, the government, can't take away from the people. But civil rights says the opposite thing. There are certain freedoms that are so important that you, the government, must protect them for the people. And that's why we say that civil liberties and civil rights represent the two sides of the same coin. Does that make sense? Questions about that? Comments, problems, complaints, anything like that? Does everybody have a basic understanding about what we mean by civil liberties, what we mean by civil rights, and the relationship between the two? Make sense? All right. Remember, between now and the end of the semester, Wednesday, June 3rd, 2 weeks left, discussion forum post on the judicial branch due tonight at 11:59 p.m. plus the 3-day grace period. Students' Choice Project due next Wednesday, that's May 27th at 11:59 p.m. plus the 3-day grace period. And test number 3, which is now available for you if you want to start working on it as well, is due on the last day, the last night, the last minute of the semester, and that is Wednesday, June 3rd, plus the 3-day grace period. All right? Questions, comments, problems about any of that stuff or anything else dealing with this class or anything else that may have nothing to do with this class or LBCC that I can help you with, you know what to do. Send me an email, send me a Canvas message, drop into my twice weekly virtual student hours on Zoom. Remember, next time that happens this afternoon, 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, and you know where to find the link and the password. Or if you need to talk to me one-on-one on Zoom and you can't meet those student hours, send me an email, send me a Canvas message. We'll work out a time for us to get together on Zoom and meet. So until I see you next time, be safe, stay well, and know that you are going to be successful in this class, and you are going to be successful in getting through this horrible period that we are going through in the US and in the world, because you are not alone. We are truly all in this together. I am here for you. I've got your back. Thanks for joining me today. I look forward to seeing you soon. Take care. Have a good one. Bye-bye.